Thomas, we've known each other for quite a while, actually, and we've done deals together as well in the past. And I wanted to kind of bring you and invite you for another one of our presentations, because you did the Alberta Advantage a while back, one of our presentations. And that was a great presentation. And we wanted to have you back, and we wanted people to know more about who Thomas Beyer is. And so I got this book from you. By the way, it's a signed autographed book. And I'm sure it's showing the wrong way. So I wanted to know if you could show your book there the right way to everyone. Would be really, really cool when the time comes. You got a couple books that you were showing there. But my first question, getting to know you a little bit more, is how did you get started and what was your first?
How I got started is, of course, a lengthy journey. The whole thing started probably when because I'm an immigrant to Canada. I came in '86 to do my MBA in Edmonton, and met my now wife there and got married. And then I started my first job in Burnaby in British Columbia. All of a sudden, people start talking about real estate. And in the 80s, if you have lived maybe through those times, you recall those were very high interest rate days, right? We're talking 13, 15%. I recall one of my colleagues saying, "Oh, I got a good deal. I locked in at 15% for 5 years." Because the spot rate or the prime rate then was like 18% or something ridiculous. I thought, this is unbelievable. Like, why would you lock in a 15% rate? People start talking about it. I was a renter then. I didn't have a clue really about buying and leverage and loan to values. But people start talking, "Oh, I bought a bungalow and man, I paid 150 grand a few years ago. Now it's worth 250, right? It's like, oh, I made $100,000, right? And a colleague of mine chatting said, oh, she was of Asian descent. She said, "Oh yeah, our family owns 10 bungalows in the Burnaby area." So, oh wow. So I did the quick math, 10 times 100,000. Well, she made $1 million the last few years. Like, look, what does she know that I don't? That's when it started, per se. '88, and when I actually bought my first property to make some money was actually almost 10 years. So it was pretty slow. So it took me time to absorb all this idea. I didn't tune into that at all until probably my mid-30s.
What was your first deal, Thomas?
But the first deal was actually a condo in Calgary, an $80,000 apartment, a 2-bedroom unit, hence the book, right? 80 lessons learned on a road from 80,000, because the first condo was an $80,000 condo in Calgary, $20,000 down, and a $60,000 mortgage. The rent was like $600 or $700 a month. I ended up selling this condo maybe 5-6 years later for about $140,000, $150,000. So I made a really nice cash on cash return, almost 400%. Right?
This book here that I have a signed autograph version from you, by the way. It says, "On the road from 80,000 to 80 million. 80 lessons learned." We probably don't want to go through all 80 because we'd like you to go and get the book, obviously. But can you give us some of the best lessons that you've learned along the way? Like real estate didn't mean anything to me at all at the beginning. And then it took you kind of watching around and then ultimately 10 years to get into it. You said you were a slow learner. What were some of the maybe top lessons that you've learned that you can share with us?
Well, one of the top lessons, and maybe because I grew up in Europe as a tenant, right, as a renter, so the idea of owning wasn't really inbred to me, with like maybe many Canadians who grew up perhaps in a house, right? But I was always a tenant, even certainly in Germany, and also as a student. And then when I lived in Canada, the first few years we were a tenant, and then we ended up buying a house, and we actually lost a bit of money in Toronto, where we lived for 3 years. But as every person knows now, real estate on average goes up, usually at least by inflation, and usually in an urban context, usually more than inflation, because you have usually a lack of land in most cities. Most cities are built out. There's almost no more raw land to develop. So you got to move out of the city to get upside or cheaper housing, or if you want to build something new in a city, you got to tear something down. So all the buildings tend to go up, or the houses tend to go up more than inflation. So if you assume inflation is 2 or 3%, and I believe it's actually much higher than that. Lesson 31: live below your means, except when it comes to your house. So the point is, you ought to live in the most expensive house you can afford. Now, that's obviously a highly personal decision. What can you afford? So if you're a couple and your wife works and you work, you can probably afford something bigger, or maybe you inherit some money from your parents. You can afford something bigger than if you're just a single guy, right, with a low income. So every person needs to say, well, what is the best property I can afford? And that's a highly personal decision, right? Given your life circumstances and where you have to commute to and where you want to live, because obviously you can move to PI tomorrow and buy something spectacularly large, but maybe the job situation in PEI isn't as good as perhaps in Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto. So, and the advantage is twofold. A, you have to live somewhere anyway, might as well be something like that. And B, it's a tax-free game, right? So if you buy a house for, I don't know, $500,000 with $100,000 down, you also buy stocks, right, for $100,000, and maybe buy them leveraged, and maybe you buy $200,000 worth of stocks for $100,000 in cash, but you pay taxes in the end when you sell it, right? So you might as well live somewhere nice, because you get a tax-free gain. If you look at this average street with an ugly house and a pretty house, the street goes up the same, right? Like over 10 years, let's say every house is up 50%. And the crappy house, which was 400, now it's now worth 600, because it went up 50%. And the pretty house for 600 goes up 50%, now it's worth 900, right? So you actually made more money living in a pretty house. Now you pay a bit more money, obviously, right? You get a bigger mortgage. So I would rather sacrifice some expenses, like your second Starbucks coffee every day, or maybe a second car, right? So we used to drive always crappy cars until just very recently we actually ended up buying a new Lexus, maybe 10, 12 years ago or something, right? But until then we always had used cars and not the finest quality, right? Because a car is a really expensive item. It's easily $500, $600, $700 a month if you count insurance and operating costs and depreciation, especially, right?
You're giving us lots of nuggets of wisdom here, Thomas. So, Thomas, another question I have here for you is, what have you been doing for the last couple of years?
The last couple of years, I've been sitting on my assets. So I'm really more of an asset manager.
Right on. Well, I know you've been spending time.
I mean, at the peak of my career, the peak was probably about 6 years ago, 2015. We were sitting at about $125 million worth of assets.
Yes.
And I realized, I don't need to go bigger. I could have gone bigger. I just choose not to, and I shouldn't say semi-retire, but certainly take the foot off the gas pedal. But I also had some misinvestments. I put far too much money in a development project in Okanagan. I lost a ton of money there. It's still ongoing. There's lawsuits and legal disputes and deficiencies to be cleaned up. So that took me the last 2 or 3 years just to dig out of the mess. So one of the lessons I talk about in my book as well is you got to clean up your messes, right? So before you buy real estate, or you want to maybe scale up and invite other people to invest with you, you got to have your own life in order, right? Because it's tough to run a company with a bunch of employees and dozens of assets, perhaps, if your own life is in complete chaos, right? You got to really have a very stable environment around you. So in terms of physical fitness or drug addictions, or perhaps divorce situations or partnership disputes, I mean, you got to clean those up, right? So it makes for a messy. If your life is messy, it's very tough to ask others to invest with you, because you just take your own mess out of your own life into the business situations, and you don't want to do that.
So where would you say you're heading right now? What's your game plan moving forward?
I'm looking at some mobile home parks.
That's exciting.
Both here in BC, and also looking to maybe go back to Texas with a partner, because Western Canada is price point wise is very, very pricey already, right? Alberta being the exception after sort of 5-year recession. Even then, the price points are quite elevated. So, but you go to Texas, or you go to Georgia or Tennessee or Arizona, or New Mexico, Oklahoma, many states come to mind where there's no rent control, and you can buy buildings which you upgrade, and turning them around, right? Turning them into what I call prestigious properties. So you buy ugly and you make them pretty or prestigious. So you buy a building for, let's say, maybe today, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a unit. You spend $10,000 a door on upgrades, and maybe you sell it for $120,000 a unit. a few years later, and you look at the cash on cash return, it's like 100%. It's quite doable over a few years. When I started, my first building was 37 a door. Right? Today, that very building looks almost the same. It's about 110,000 a door in Edmonton.
Wow.
And yes, the rent is higher, but the building looks just as ugly as it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, Same stucco box, same balconies, same bushes, same everything, same street. Nothing really has changed, and the buildings may be a bit nicer on the inside, but the cap rates have compressed because the interest rates are so much lower today.
Mm-hmm. So how does running a real estate business impact your family when you were super busy?
Well, I think you have to be able to delegate. So you have to look at what are you really good at, and that's actually a good thing to do for someone who's maybe wants to grow, and maybe you're a painter today, or a plumber, or you're a computer programmer. It's actually good to create a list and they put that on your fridge and have sort of 5 categories. And one is, what are you really good at or excellent at? What are you just good at? Maybe above average. What are you just average at? What are you poor at? And what are you lousy at? Some people are very salesy, they relate very well with people, right? Which is really important if you want to raise money, but maybe not so good with numbers, perhaps, right? So you got to find some people around you who compensate you in where you're not so good at.
So what were your hours like when you were working and really growing from that 80,000 to 80 million? What were your hours like? What kind of hours did you put in? Did you have a work-life balance or a family balance?
Yeah, I would say so. But if you own your own company, you work all the time. You're always on, right? You talk to my wife, you go on vacation, you take phone calls, or you do email, or right. It's tough, and sometimes you have to say, look, take your cell phone away, you shut it off, and you go to the beach for a week, and guess what? Usually the world doesn't fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
And you can delegate. Real estate has some cycles. Let's say you write an offer on the building. You know what the timelines are. You can go away for a week. But for example, I was just refinancing a building in Calgary. We got this locked in an amazing 1.46% CMHC insured rate.
Wow.
And as you go to the closing of that refinance, I know there's always paper to sign. There's always last minute stuff. The lawyer wants to get a hold of you. Oh, yeah, and signature. I need a witness, and I need this document signed, initial. You got to be available for that. Now, not 24/7. You can say, look, phone me in the morning from 9 to 10, or you check your email once a day. That you can do that, right? But you go to Hawaii and you're closing a building or you're refinancing. You got to be available to sign a document, or maybe even do a quick phone call. But you also can work in the evening and maybe spend time with the kids in the afternoon, or go on school trips with the kids. I did that a lot, right? Or I took my both kids to Europe several times, either as a family or just sometimes took one kid and we went for a week and saw my parents, for example. So you can do that. Right? So you have a lot more flexibility than working sort of 9 to 5 at BC Hydro or TELUS or IBM, whatever.
I have some of the experience that you have in real estate, and a lot of what you're saying makes sense to me. And boy, you're telling what needs to be listened to. And so everyone, listen to what Thomas here is saying, and really glean what he's also not saying, because there's certain things you're not saying. You're kind of just little tiny dropping little hints in between of the best practices that we could be implementing. Another question for you is, what's your favorite project you ever worked on? What's the best one you've ever?
Well, there's many. You got to enjoy what you're doing, and I've been doing real estate since 1997. That was my first condo, and then I bought 3 condos, and I bought a building in 2000. I still enjoy buying assets. Mm-hmm. And going through the documents and sifting out issues, because whenever you buy an asset, which is usually an existing asset, right? An existing asset by definition has issues. Right? Let's say there's a leaky roof, or there's a bunch of old fridges, or the landscaping is crappy. Mm-hmm. That's just expected. You got to now spend some money on landscaping, or maybe fix the roof, or rip out the carpets, or change the fridges, or do new windows. That's just expected. But you got to be able to size that. So if you buy a building and the roof is leaky, well, that's okay, as long as the price is okay, right? And adjust for that. So I enjoy the acquisition process.
So it's not
and the turnaround process, and probably the best deal we did was that very large building complex in Dallas, where we bought just before the financial crisis in 2007 for $13.2 million, 300 units, so it's about, and we ended up selling it for almost $25 million, like at the highest price per square foot at that town at the time. And I really enjoyed that process because obviously you see the rent roll grow, you see the improvements, you see how the building physically is better, right? You change the pools and pave the parking lot, or fix the siding and replace the balconies and the air conditioning units. You get better tenant profiles, you improve people's lives living there, kicking out bums perhaps, or drug dealers. So I enjoy that turnaround process. In almost any building, everyone enjoys a good ride, right? Because a rising tide lifts all boats.
It's a good point.
But the critical thing is you got to have a boat in the water.
Absolutely. It makes me think,
as they say, boats are safe in harbor, but that's not what they're built for.
It makes me think about you doing all this U.S. business, because I kind of shied away from doing the U.S. because I'm not a U.S. citizen. But you're not a U.S. citizen either, are you?
No.
You just employed the right people, didn't you?
Well, it always confuses people, and as soon as they start listening to me, say, "Oh, you got an accent. Where you're from?" Say, "Oh, I'm from Canada." Immediately they get confused. I mean, in the U.S., the process is the same as if you buy it in Calgary or Toronto. You gotta look at the area first. Is the area, does it have upside on jobs? Mm-hmm. And then the micro location within that area, and then you look at the physical building. Right? I mean, the process is very similar. I mean, you could shoot me into, I don't know, Memphis, Tennessee, or Atlanta tomorrow, but I've never been. I could probably find you in a day or two. Can find you a decent building, right? Because I got the skill to do that. Although I don't know the city at all, but eventually you look at 5 or 10 buildings, and you say, "Oh, this one is a good deal, and this one is not." Right?
And you know the right questions to ask and who to ask. So if you could start all over again, Thomas, what would you do differently?
Sometimes I would do maybe a bit more research and be less spontaneous, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But it's a fine balance of the attitude of let's just do it, right? Let's go for it, because there's risk involved. As soon as you write a check or buy something, there's risk, right? But a bit like life, you marry someone or you have kids, I mean, there's risk involved. Sometimes maybe you have to think maybe a little bit longer. But some people I know also think far too long, and then they don't get married because they never find quite the right partner. Because there's always something to criticize with the potential spouse or the potential house they want to buy, and or stay renters because the house is not quite right, the color is wrong, or the location is wrong, it's too expensive, and they never make the move. And guess what? Oh, yeah, I'm going to wait in Vancouver to buy a house because it's going to drop. Oh no, it's not going to drop, man. You had your chance. You can get hurt. Like I did in my Okanagan development project, I just didn't do enough research. I trusted the person I worked with far too much. I put far too much money in. So that was something I would do differently, and maybe bring on partners, maybe slightly slower and maybe slightly less ambitious, because we've grown very fast.
What are some of the stress management tools that you were able to really?
I think that's personal, but I mean, I do a lot of walking or swimming in the summer, or now where we live in the Sunshine Coast, kayaking, because we have a house on the water. Mm-hmm. I can take my kayak right from the waterfront down to into the water. That's awesome. Or some people like biking. I like biking when we lived in Vancouver. Later e-biking. I also have a Vespa scooter, so I just take that off for a ride. I just like to explore new things. Take my Vespa somewhere on my bike, or just go for a walk. Take the bus somewhere. Exit the station and just walk around for an hour. Just look at a new neighborhood in Surrey or in Coquitlam. Just to see something. That's what I enjoy. But every person needs to find it for themselves. Some people pray a lot. They go to church. They meditate. I don't do that per se. I mean, I do naps sometimes. Maybe more so now that I turned 60 last year, so maybe I need more naps today than perhaps 20 years ago. But I think pacing is critical. And one chapter in the book is called Eile mit Weile, which means go fast, go really hard, but you got to stop once in a while, right? So I think that pacing works for me. Really hard at short bursts, maybe for an hour or two. I can get stuff done really, really fast, but I need a break, right? And that each person needs to find that for themselves. Because some people work really well in the morning and they get up at 5:30 and boom, boom, boom. By 9 o'clock, they get a lot done. And some people get up at 9:30 and, but then they work till 2 o'clock in the morning, right? It's just okay. You just need to find your pacing and find out where you're really efficient at what times of the day, and then sort of arrange your life around that. And that can be hard if you have kids or family but I work from home almost as soon as I sometimes, and you look around and say, oh man, I could buy this land and build something here. I could buy this building. So I think it's more a matter of you got to constrain yourself, because there's always opportunity anywhere you look. And you look at the immigration now into Canada in the next few years. I mean, 400,000 people a year. That's over the next 10 years. That's another 4 million people.
All have to live somewhere.
They have to all either rent something or buy something, right? And the number one dream of any immigrant is to own something.
Absolutely.
And it's not usually a tiny condo in an ugly building. It's usually something nice, right? That's the dream. Now, not every person can achieve that dream.
So, Thomas, I kind of want to, there's so many more questions I want to ask you. And I want to actually dive a little bit further into syndications. Maybe we can do that in the future. But I really wanted to, I have two more questions. And the first is, how did your current team get formed, or how do you form teams? I find that a really interesting question.
Yeah, there's no real scientific answer. I mean, I talked earlier about your strengths and weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
So if let's say, maybe you're very creative, maybe you're a good salesperson, but maybe you're poor at numbers, find someone who is really good with numbers. Right? Don't find another sales guy, because you're a good sales guy. Then don't find another guy like you. Don't find a clone of yourself. Find someone who is almost opposite yourself, right? And you find often you have good marriages actually where people are opposite, right? If you have two really wild people who like to party all the time, well, often the marriage doesn't last that long, because they party all the time, meet new people, and guess what? They party out of the marriage. Or they have two really quiet people. Also, it's a very, very quiet life at home. Sometimes you need the balance.
That's hilarious.
So I look for three things. One, you need to look at that skill set, right? So if you're looking for an accounting type person, is the person really a good accountant, right? You gotta assess that. The second thing, do you trust this guy? Like, so if the guy tells you something, like that, is that actually true? Which was, I found in the end, that was the big issue with my partner or former partner in Okanagan. I just in the end didn't trust him anymore. He was in fact a liar, and told many stories, and many stories were just not true, right? So you gotta, do you respect the guy for the skills? Do you trust the person? Which is an honesty thing, right? Or an ethics thing, right?
Yes.
And then the third thing is, do you like the guy or gal? So if you sit in the car for 4 hours and drive from Vancouver to Kelowna, can you handle a 4-hour car ride with this person? Or do you say, oh my God, I have to go in the car with this guy for 4 hours. I have a meeting, have dinner with him. I say, oh my God, I'm not looking forward to that. Well, maybe you shouldn't work with this person, right? You gotta really looking forward. Yeah, I love to go with this guy to Vernon and look at some buildings, and spend an afternoon or maybe overnight, because we used to stay overnight. Or fly to Texas together for 2 days. Do you actually enjoy that, or do you say, oh my God, take 2 days with this guy, I'm gonna kill myself? So do you respect the guy? Do you trust the guy? And do you like the guy? Are sort of three things I think you want to look for. And then you need to sort of arrange at least, I mean, ideally maybe very formal, but at least understand who does what and who gets paid for what, right? Because at some point there's money involved usually. Yeah. And if you buy buildings, the money portion can get in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars potentially. And real estate is somewhat similar, because it's very upfront intensive. There's a lot of work upfront. After you own an asset, there's a bit of work still, obviously, as you turn it around. But once you own it, and maybe you're in for 6 months, it's not much to do anymore, right? There's the occasional oversight and the occasional phone call, obviously, and annual accounting and stuff. And then at some point you exit, and there's again more work, or maybe a refinance event. But for a long time, 2, 3, 4 years, and there's not all that much work actually, right? So you can actually manage a large number of assets. I mean, today we still own 40 million worth of assets. It sounds like a lot, but it's actually only 5. It's 2 big buildings and 3 mobile home parks. So it's 5 assets. That's a part-time job, right? You don't need 3-4 people for that. I can do it in 2 afternoons a week.
That's awesome.
You know?
So Thomas, we're coming to the end of our interview. I noticed that you had 2 books that you showed earlier on. So at the end, I'd like for you to maybe show that and maybe where they can get them, and you can get me the Amazon link and so on. But before we do that, think of one mentor's wise words to you that you can remember. Can you share that? One mentor's wise words to you that you can remember, and can you please share that? It can be a saying or a quote.
Well, there's many, obviously, right? I mean, I have almost in this book I wrote for 80 lessons. I have so 1 quote per chapter. Actually, it's probably 80 quotes in here.
Perfect. Pick one.
Pick one.
Pick one. The best one. Which one that comes into mind right away?
Well, as a Christian caring capitalist, chapter 1 of my book is called "Man Plans and God Laughs," and the quote is from T.S. Eliot, who was a Christian writer, which who said, "What you thought you came for is only a shell, a husk of meaning from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled. For us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business." So I think you got to find joy in the putting your boat in the water and jumping in the pool and trying something, because you don't know what the outcome is, and there's obviously trials and tribulations in between, you know. But you have no idea. So you buy a house in Surrey and you think it's all great and it's going to go up in value, and then the plumbing breaks and the roof leaks and the tenants start to trash the house, and it's going to be hell. 6 months in, you have no idea. So I think you gotta have an open eye and be flexible, because things start happening in life and you just don't know. So you're not in control, you know, as you might think you are.
Find that emotional equilibrium is what it sounds like to me. Thomas, where can we find a book? Where can we find the book?
Well, books these days, as you know, are often electronic. So you can get the physical book, of course, in like Amazon has a physical book, and I broke it into 3 little ebooks.
Great.
Which is life lessons, business lessons, and real estate lessons. You type in my name or 80 lessons learned, you should find it. Or you go to Amazon, you can find it.
Perfect.
And then I co-wrote a book with Ozzy Jurek, who many of you know. Ozzy runs one of the real estate groups, very successfully here for probably 30 years now in the Vancouver area.
Absolutely.
He published a book where I was a co-author. There was another 49 authors or 50 co-authors. So I wrote a chapter in the book about how to raise money, and you got to learn how to do that. So I talk about this in this book. Nice. And it's called Real Estate Action 2.0, which is, and Ozzy Jurek is the main author. There's a number of good lessons in there.
Yeah.
About how to basically get from, you know, ready, set into this go and action mode, because obviously at some point you got to act, you got to write. Absolutely. You got to write an offer, and you got to raise conditions on some building, because I have not bought one asset yet without writing an offer first. Right, so that's how it starts. Writing an offer is an option to buy, but an obligation to sell. So you have the option to walk away, because usually you write a conditional offer and maybe subject to financing. You need only one condition, actually. And the favorite condition I like is subject to viewing satisfactory to the purchaser. That's it. You don't need anything else. Now, obviously, you do a lot of stuff in the background, because you got to get financing, but often maybe you're already pre-qualified for a certain loan, right? Mm-hmm. But you got to walk in a building, or you walk around and say, you know what, I don't like the color of the paint, sorry, and I can't buy it. Now, we can't do it too often in a small market, because people, you know, you build a name for yourself. But if in doubt, I would say write the offer, and then inspect the property so thoroughly, and maybe hire inspectors, and that costs some money, obviously, and then you decide whether to waive or not. And you can always ask for a haircut, right? Doesn't mean that the seller will accept it. As I just did in Cranbrook, I had a building under contract. I spent probably $20,000. There was a major foundational problem, which was bigger than expected, and I asked for a price reduction to compensate for the relatively large problem, which was probably a $250,000 to $300,000 problem.
Wow. And
the seller said, nope, no discount, sorry.
Wow.
So we agreed to disagree, and the building is still owned by him, and hey, he makes 15 grand a month, what does he care? Then it's, especially in the current market where there's often very few motivated sellers, you got to close the gap as the buyer. And if you don't do that, then there's no deal. So that happens too. But again, you got to look out at least 2 or 3 or 4 years and see where could that asset be in 3-4 years, and usually higher, but of course not guaranteed. That's where sort of the faith comes in and the risk perception. And
so I definitely want to have you back, Thomas, because we're going to be talking about negotiating secrets, we're going to be talking about syndications, and we're going to be talking about your next deal, because that sounds pretty exciting.
Okay.
Thomas, this was an awesome session. I just sat and listened. It's pretty much all I did was sit and listen to the great advice, to the wisdoms, and obviously to the lessons that you've learned in your real estate career over the years. And we'd love to have you back.
Which is another lesson, and there's a reason why God gave you 2 ears and only 1 mouth. Sometimes that's a skill, actually listening, because when you got to actually make an effort to listen. Because sometimes maybe my wife talks to me and I just don't listen, right? And she's, oh, I told you to do this, and oh yeah, I probably did, but I just didn't connect, right? So I think listening is actually really important, and sometimes playing a little bit dumber, especially if you buy a building and pretend something. You actually know the answer to the question, but you just ask the question and then listen carefully what the seller says. Might be worth $100,000 by just zipping it, man. Mm-hmm. But listening carefully to what the seller has to say.
Thomas, thanks so much for being here with us. Go check out his book. He's going to put it up the right way, and show your name clearly if you can.
Thomas Beyer, that's right, Beyer, and yeah.
Perfect.
Let's do it again. Thanks, Odin.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Thanks, everyone.